On the morning of November 3rd, 1957, a 12-year-old paperboy in Alexandria, Virginia discovered something that would unravel one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence networks operating on American soil. His name was Thomas Beckett Riley. He delivered the Washington Post to 47 houses on his route through the quiet suburban streets of Del Rey. He was saving money for a bicycle, the kind with chrome handlebars and a speedometer mounted on the frame. He had no interest in politics, no understanding of espionage, no reason to believe that the hollow nickel he found on the sidewalk that morning would lead to arrests across 3 countries, expose a decades-long penetration of U.S. military intelligence, and ultimately cost him everything he thought was safe about his world. By all accounts, he was an ordinary American kid, the kind who collected baseball cards, struggled with long division, and rode his Schwinn through neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone else's name. But on that cold November morning, when the nickel split open in his hands and revealed a microfilm message written in Russian, Thomas Riley became something else entirely. He became a witness. And in the world of Cold War espionage, witnesses were never allowed to remain ordinary for long. The morning of November 3rd, 1957 began the way most mornings began for Thomas Beckett Riley. At 5:47 a.m., his alarm clock rattled on the nightstand beside his bed, a wind-up model with bells loud enough to wake the entire second floor of the narrow colonial house on Mount Vernon Avenue. He silenced it quickly, trained by 2 years of paper route discipline to move fast and quiet so his younger sister wouldn't wake. The room was cold. November had settled into Northern Virginia with the kind of damp chill that made blankets feel necessary until the moment you had to leave them. Thomas dressed in the dark, pulling on dungarees still slightly stiff from his mother's washing, a flannel shirt, and the wool sweater his grandmother had sent from Pennsylvania last Christmas. His sneakers were by the door where he'd left them the night before, laces already tied loose enough to slip on without fussing. Downstairs, the kitchen light was on. His mother was already awake, standing at the counter in her bathrobe, pouring coffee from the percolator into a thermos. She did this every morning, had done it since Thomas started the route in the fall of 1955, back when he was 10 and barely strong enough to manage the canvas newspaper bag when it was full. She never said much this early, just handed him the thermos, checked that he had his gloves, and reminded him to be home by 7:15 for breakfast before school. This morning was no different. She looked tired the way she always looked lately, her hair pinned back, her face showing the lines that seemed to have appeared suddenly after his father came back from Korea. She touched his shoulder as he took the thermos, a brief gesture that felt like all the things she didn't say out loud. Be safe. Pay attention. Come home. The garage door creaked when he lifted it, the sound sharp in the pre-dawn quiet. His bicycle leaned against the wall next to his father's Buick, a blue and white Schwinn with wide handlebars and a wire basket mounted over the front wheel. The basket was where the papers went, folded tight and stacked in rows so they wouldn't spill when he took the corners. Thomas wheeled the bike down the driveway and into the street, his breath visible in the November air, small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The neighborhood was still dark, the street lamps casting yellow pools of light at regular intervals down Mount Vernon Avenue. Most of the houses were silent, windows black, driveways empty. This was the only time of day when Alexandria felt like it belonged to him alone. The distribution point was 6 blocks away, in the parking lot behind Dawson's Hardware on Commonwealth Avenue. The Washington Post truck was already there when Thomas arrived, idling with its headlights on, exhaust rising in thick white plumes. The driver was a man named Carl, mid-50s, balding, perpetually irritated by the cold and by paperboys who showed up late. He barely looked at Thomas as he handed over the bundle, 63 papers bound with twine, the ink still smelling sharp and chemical. Thomas counted them quickly, habit more than necessity, then loaded them into his basket and the saddlebag he'd rigged over the rear fender. The route took an hour on a good morning, longer if it was raining or if Mrs. Patterson at the end of Nottingham Drive wanted to talk about her nephew in the Navy. He started on Commonwealth Avenue, working north toward Braddock Road. The streets were empty except for the occasional car, early commuters heading toward Washington, their headlights sweeping across the trees that lined the sidewalks. The trees were mostly bare now, their branches skeletal against the pale gray sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east. Thomas rode slowly, coasting when he could, using his legs to push off when the incline required it. The papers landed with soft thumps on porches and walkways, each one folded and thrown with the practiced accuracy of repetition. He didn't think about what he was doing. His hands moved automatically, grab, fold, throw, pedal, repeat. His mind was somewhere else, halfway between sleep and the vague awareness that he had a geography test third period and hadn't studied the way he should have. By the time he turned onto Quaker Lane, the sky had shifted from black to a deep bruised purple, the kind of early light that made everything look slightly unreal. Quaker Lane was one of the quieter streets on his route, a narrow road lined with modest brick houses set back from the sidewalk behind small front yards. Most of the residents were older couples, retirees or near retirees, people who kept their lawns trim and their hedges square. Thomas delivered to 7 houses on Quaker Lane, starting at the north end and working his way down. He was 3 houses in when he saw the nickel, It was lying on the sidewalk near the curb, just past the Kowalski house at number 1407. At first, he almost didn't stop. Nickels weren't unusual, people dropped change all the time, and 5 cents wasn't worth much even to a 12-year-old saving for a new bike. But something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the way it reflected the streetlight, or maybe it was just the instinct that made him notice things that were slightly out of place. He braked, set his foot down, and bent to pick it up. The metal was cold, smooth, heavier than a nickel should be. He turned it over in his hand, frowning. It looked normal. Jefferson's profile on one side, Monticello on the other, the date stamp beneath. 1948. But the weight was wrong. He pressed his thumb against the edge, and the coin split open. It happened so suddenly that Thomas almost dropped it. The nickel separated into 2 halves, neat as a clamshell, revealing a hollow interior. Inside, pressed into the tiny space, was something that looked like a small piece of film, dark and translucent, covered in markings he couldn't read. He stared at it, his breath coming faster, his heart doing something strange in his chest. The markings were letters, but not English letters. They were angular, unfamiliar, packed tight in rows that looked like they'd been typed on the smallest typewriter in the world. He didn't speak Russian. He'd never seen Russian text before, not in real life, only in the newsreels at the Apex Theater when they showed footage of Stalin or Khrushchev speaking at the Kremlin. But he knew what he was looking at. This was something Soviet. Thomas closed the nickel carefully, his hands shaking slightly now. Not from the cold, but from something else. Something that felt like fear and excitement mixed together in a way he didn't have words for. He looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed he was standing in the middle of the sidewalk under a streetlight. The street was still empty. No cars. No movement in any of the windows. Just the wind moving through the bare branches overhead and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere on the next block. He shoved the nickel into his pocket, the metal pressing against his thigh through the denim. His pulse was loud in his ears. He didn't know what he'd found. Not exactly, but he knew it was wrong. He knew it didn't belong on a sidewalk in Alexandria, Virginia. He finished the route on autopilot, throwing the last papers without really seeing where they landed. His mind was racing, turning over possibilities, trying to make sense of what a hollow nickel with Russian writing was doing 3 houses down from where the Kowalskis lived. By the time Thomas turned back onto Mount Vernon Avenue, the sun was fully up, pale and cold behind a layer of thin clouds. The neighborhood had come alive in the hour he'd been gone. Cars were backing out of driveways, mothers were standing on porches calling children inside for breakfast, and the smell of bacon and coffee drifted from open kitchen windows. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. But Thomas Riley rode his bicycle down the familiar street with a hollow nickel in his pocket, and a feeling in his chest that the world he thought he knew had just revealed itself to be something else entirely. To understand why the nickel mattered, to understand why Thomas Riley felt the cold weight of it in his pocket all through breakfast and all through the walk to school, you have to understand the neighborhood he lived in and the people who lived there with him. Alexandria in 1957 was a city caught between identities. It was old, older than the nation itself, with colonial-era buildings and streets named after Revolutionary War generals. But it was also new in the way that post-war American suburbs were new, filling up with young families drawn by government jobs in Washington and the promise of affordable housing and developments that hadn't existed 10 years earlier. Thomas's neighborhood, Del Rey, had settled into a kind of orderly middle-class rhythm that felt quintessentially American. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, children riding bicycles in the afternoons, fathers in suits boarding buses to the Pentagon or the Navy Yard. But underneath that surface calm, there was something else, attention and awareness. This was 1957, the height of the Cold War, and everyone knew it even if they didn't talk about it directly. The Soviet Union had tested a hydrogen bomb. The Rosenbergs had been executed 4 years earlier for passing atomic secrets. Senator McCarthy's hearings were still fresh in public memory. People watched each other more carefully than they admitted. They noticed who got mail from overseas, who had accents, who kept unusual hours. The FBI encouraged this watchfulness, published pamphlets about how to spot communist sympathizers, ran advertisements asking citizens to report suspicious behavior. It was presented as patriotism. Thomas's father believed it. Robert James Riley had served in Korea as a combat engineer, came home in 1953 with a Bronze Star and shrapnel scars on his left shoulder that ached when the weather turned cold. He'd found work at the Pentagon, a civilian position in the logistics division, nothing glamorous but steady and secure. He was 34 years old, serious, quiet, the kind of man who read the newspaper thoroughly every morning and listened to Edward R. Murrow on the radio every evening. He didn't talk much about Korea, but he talked about the Soviets, about the threat they posed, about the necessity of vigilance. He'd told Thomas more than once that the communists didn't fight fair, that they sent spies and saboteurs, that they worked in shadows and used ordinary people as cover. His mother, Margaret Riley, had different concerns. She worried about safety in more immediate terms, strangers, traffic, the creek behind the school where a boy had drowned 2 summers ago. She'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the daughter of a coal miner, and she'd never fully adjusted to the proximity of city life. She was 32, with auburn hair she kept pinned up and hands that were always busy. She volunteered at the church on Sundays and reminded Thomas constantly to be polite, be careful, don't talk to strangers, don't tell people your father works at the Pentagon. That last instruction had always puzzled Thomas. Why would it matter? But she insisted, and he obeyed. Thomas's route took him past 47 houses, but there were a few that stood out. The Kowalskis at 1407 Quaker Lane, Mrs. Patterson at the end of Nottingham Drive, who always wanted to talk, the Hendersons at 1219 Commonwealth Avenue. The Hendersons were different. They weren't friendly exactly, but they weren't unfriendly either. They were formal. Mr. Henderson worked for the State Department, something administrative that required him to travel frequently. Mrs. Henderson taught piano lessons in the front room of their house 3 afternoons a week. They'd lived in the neighborhood for 6 years and kept to themselves in a way that seemed deliberate. They didn't attend block parties. They were polite when spoken to, but never initiated conversation. And they had a lodger. His name was Emil Goldfuss, or at least that's what the Hendersons called him. He'd moved into the basement apartment in March of 1957, 8 months before Thomas found the nickel. Thomas remembered the day clearly because it had been unusual. Most people didn't rent out space in Delray, but the Hendersons had no children, and their basement had been finished with a separate entrance, and apparently they'd decided the extra income was worth having a tenant. Emil Goldfuss appeared one afternoon with 2 suitcases and a wooden crate. No moving truck, no furniture, no friends helping. Just a taxi that dropped him at the curb and drove away. He was a small man, middle-aged, somewhere in his 50s, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. He wore a dark wool coat despite the mild weather and carried himself with a kind of careful precision, the way someone might move if they were constantly aware of being watched. Thomas had nodded at him in passing, and Goldfuss had nodded back. His expression neutral, unreadable. Over the following months, Thomas saw Goldfuss regularly. The man kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving early in the morning, sometimes not emerging until afternoon. He carried an artist's portfolio, a flat leather case that suggested he worked in some creative field. Goldfuss received mail, always from New York, always in plain manila envelopes with typed addresses. He never received packages. He never had visitors. He was polite when they crossed paths, offering brief greetings in a slightly accented voice that Thomas couldn't quite place. European, maybe. The accent was faint, nearly invisible, but it was there. Thomas had mentioned Goldfuss to his father once, casually during dinner. Asked if he knew what kind of artist lived in the Hendersons' basement. His father had looked up from his plate, interested suddenly. "What kind of accent does he have?" his father asked. Thomas said he wasn't sure. "European." His father had nodded slowly, then told Thomas to stay away from him, not in an angry way, but in a serious way that made Thomas pay attention. "Don't talk to him more than you have to. Don't tell him anything about our family. And if you notice anything strange, anything at all, you tell me." Thomas had agreed, confused but obedient. That conversation had been in August. Now it was November, and Thomas had found a hollow nickel 3 houses down from where Emil Goldfuss lived. The connection wasn't obvious. The nickel could have been dropped by anyone. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. He'd been delivering papers to this route for 2 years, and he'd never found anything like it. And now, less than a block from where a man with a European accent lived in a basement apartment, receiving mail from New York, and keeping hours that didn't match any normal job, Thomas had found a piece of Soviet espionage equipment. He'd looked at it again during lunch period at school, sitting in a bathroom stall where no one could see, carefully opening the 2 halves and examining the microfilm inside. The text was definitely Russian. He'd confirmed it by comparing it to a photograph of a Soviet propaganda poster in his history textbook. The letters matched, Cyrillic. Unreadable to him, but unmistakably foreign. The question was what to do about it. Thomas considered his options throughout the school day, distracted during lessons, barely hearing his teachers. He could throw it away, pretend he'd never found it. But that felt wrong, felt cowardly. His father had fought in a war. His father worked at the Pentagon, and Thomas had found something that might be important, might be connected to the kind of threats his father warned about. But telling someone meant consequences he couldn't predict. It meant questions. It meant adults getting involved, maybe the police, maybe the FBI. Thomas had heard stories about the FBI, about how they investigated people, about how once they started asking questions, they didn't stop until they'd turned your entire life inside out. But he also couldn't keep it secret. The weight of it was too much. By the time Thomas walked home from school that afternoon, he'd made his decision. He would tell his father, show him the nickel, let him decide what to do. His father would know. His father had security clearance and contacts and experience with this kind of thing. Thomas felt relieved once he'd made the choice. But there was also fear, because telling his father meant acknowledging that something dangerous had entered their world. That evening after dinner, Thomas found his father in the garage, bent over the workbench, repairing a lamp that had stopped working. He stood in the doorway for a moment, rehearsing what he wanted to say, then pulled the nickel from his pocket and held it out. "Dad, I found something. You need to see this." His father turned, saw the expression on Thomas's face, and set down the screwdriver. He took the nickel, examined it, pressed the edge the way Thomas had, and watched it split open. His face went very still. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. Thomas told him. "Quaker Lane. 3 houses. From the Hendersons. Near where that man Goldfuss lived." His father looked at the microfilm, tilted it toward the light, then looked at Thomas with an expression that was equal parts pride and concern. "You did the right thing bringing this to me," he said. "But this is serious, Tom. This is very serious." And from that moment, everything changed. Thomas Riley kept the nickel hidden for 2 days. He didn't tell anyone at school, didn't mention it to his sister, didn't even look at it in places where someone might see. He kept it in his pocket during the day, feeling the weight of it against his leg, and at night he placed it in the back corner of his sock drawer, buried beneath winter clothes. The secret sat inside him with a physical presence, something heavy that made it difficult to concentrate. During math class on November 4th, Mrs. Henderson called on him twice to answer questions he hadn't heard her ask. At dinner that same evening, his mother asked if he felt ill. He looked pale, she said. Thomas told her he was fine, just tired from the route. On the second night, after his sister had gone to sleep, Thomas took the nickel from the drawer and examined it again under his desk lamp. He worked carefully, separating the 2 halves with slow precision. The microfilm inside was still there, covered in the angular Cyrillic script he couldn't read. He tried during study hall to copy some of the letters into his notebook, thinking he might look them up at the library. But the letters were too small, too densely packed. He gave up, frustrated and increasingly anxious about what the message might contain. Instructions for sabotage, codes for passing secrets, names of other spies. The possibilities spiraled in his mind. What troubled Thomas most was the proximity of where he'd found it. 3 houses from the Hendersons, less than 100 yards from where Emil Goldfuss lived in that basement apartment. Thomas had walked past that house hundreds of times, thrown newspapers onto that porch, waved politely to Goldfuss when their paths crossed. Had the man been watching him? Had he noticed Thomas's father leaving for work each morning, noticed the Pentagon parking sticker on the Buick's windshield? The thought made his skin crawl. He closed the nickel and made his decision. He couldn't carry this alone anymore. He found his father in the garage after dinner on November 5th, repairing a lamp. Thomas stood in the doorway, the nickel clenched in his fist, rehearsing the words. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, I found something. You need to see this." His father turned, saw the expression on Thomas's face, and set down the screwdriver. Thomas held out the nickel. His father took it, examined it, then pressed his thumb against the edge. The coin split open. For several seconds, Robert Riley didn't move. He just stared at the microfilm, his face going very still. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. Thomas told him everything. The morning of November 3rd, the sidewalk on Quaker Lane, the location near where Goldfuss lived. His father listened without interrupting, still holding the nickel. When Thomas finished, his father closed the coin carefully and looked at him with pride and deep concern. "You did the right thing bringing this to me," he said. "But this is serious, Tom. This is very serious. Stay here." Robert Riley walked into the house and picked up the telephone in the kitchen. The conversation was brief, conducted in a low voice. When he returned 15 minutes later, his face was set in hard lines. He told Thomas that some people were coming to talk to him, that he should tell them exactly what he'd told his father, and that he shouldn't be afraid. But there was something in his father's eyes that contradicted the reassurance. The FBI agents arrived at 8:47 p.m. 2 men in dark suits. They introduced themselves as Special Agent Donovan and Special Agent Kirsch and shook Thomas's hand with a formality that made him feel both important and very small. The interview took place in the living room. Thomas sat on the sofa beside his father. The agents took chairs across from them. They were gentle, speaking in calm voices, asking questions that felt conversational. But Thomas understood that every word he said was being written down. They asked him to describe the morning of November 3rd. Where exactly had he found the nickel? What time? Had he seen anyone nearby? Thomas answered carefully, trying to remember everything. Agent Kirsch examined the nickel under a magnifying glass, then sealed it in an evidence bag. The agents asked about Emil Goldfuss. How long had he lived in the neighborhood? Had Thomas ever spoken to him beyond basic greetings? Had Goldfuss ever asked questions about his family or his father's work? Thomas said no. The interview lasted 90 minutes. When it concluded, Agent Donovan told Thomas he'd been very helpful, that what he'd found was important, and that the FBI would be investigating further. He said Thomas shouldn't discuss this with anyone outside his immediate family. It was a matter of national security. The agents left, their car disappearing into the November darkness. Within hours, Thomas's discovery had initiated a chain reaction. Surveillance teams were being organized. Background checks were being initiated. The hollow nickel was sent to the FBI laboratory. The microfilm was developed, revealing a coded message, and Emil Goldfuss was about to become the subject of one of the most intensive counterintelligence operations in FBI history. By November 6th, surveillance had been placed on the Henderson residence. FBI agents in unmarked cars watched the house, photographing everyone who came and went. They tapped the phone line. They intercepted the mail. They ran background checks on Emil Goldfuss and discovered that identity was almost certainly fabricated. There was no birth certificate, no employment history prior to 1954. Goldfuss had appeared fully formed with documents that looked authentic but crumbled under scrutiny. Soviet illegals operating under assumed American identities had been a growing concern since World War II. The Rosenberg case had exposed one network. Now they'd stumbled onto another. The investigation expanded rapidly. FBI headquarters coordinated with field offices in New York, where Goldfuss received his mail. Agents traced the return addresses on the manila envelopes. They discovered a photography studio in Brooklyn and placed it under surveillance. They found a safe deposit box. They began building a profile of a man who didn't exist, but who was operating inside the United States with hostile purpose. Thomas was told to continue his paper route as if nothing had happened. Act normal. Don't change your routine. The FBI needed time to build their case. So Thomas woke at 5:47 a.m. on November 7th and rode his bicycle through the dark streets, delivering papers to the same houses. But everything felt different. Every shadow seemed suspicious. And when he passed the Henderson house, he wondered if Emil Goldfuss was watching. The surveillance of Emil Goldfuss lasted 7 months. FBI agents rotated through unmarked vehicles on Commonwealth Avenue, photographing every person who approached the Henderson residence, logging every phone call, tracking every piece of mail. The FBI was building a case slowly but comprehensively, leaving no gaps for defense attorneys to exploit. The breakthrough came from Paris. In May 1957, a Soviet KGB officer named Reino Heinonen walked into the U.S. Embassy and requested asylum. Heinonen was 45, Finnish by birth, recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and trained as an illegal agent. He'd been living in the United States since 1952 under the alias Eugene Maki, operating as a courier. But Heinonen had problems. He drank heavily and had embezzled KGB funds. In April 1957, he'd received orders to return to Moscow. Heinonen knew what that meant: interrogation, imprisonment, possibly execution. So he went to Paris and defected. The CIA debriefed Heinonen for weeks. What emerged was a detailed map of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. Operations running since the late 1940s with remarkable success. Heinonen described dead drops in Central Park where microfilm was exchanged. He described coded messages in New York Times classified ads. He described his superior, a Soviet colonel operating under deep cover in New York City. Heinonen knew him only by his code name, Mark. But he could describe him, a small man, middle-aged, graying hair, glasses, an artist who worked from a Brooklyn studio. The description matched Emil Goldfuss perfectly. The FBI moved quickly. By early June, they'd confirmed Goldfuss and Mark were the same person. Surveillance intensified. Agents followed Goldfuss to the Ovington Studios in Brooklyn, a converted warehouse where he maintained a second residence. They observed his routines, photographed everyone he contacted, and began identifying the nodes of his network. What they discovered was staggering. Goldfuss, whose real name was Rudolf Abel, had been operating in the United States since 1948. 9 years of successful espionage, running networks that penetrated military installations, defense contractors, and scientific research facilities. Abel's agents had provided Moscow with information on atomic weapons, radar technology, military communications, and strategic defense planning. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally briefed President Eisenhower, explaining they were on the verge of arresting one of the most successful Soviet spies ever to operate on American soil. The hollow nickel Thomas Riley found was a backup communication device. Soviet intelligence used them for emergency messages, small pieces of microfilm that could be hidden in plain sight and passed between agents. The nickel had been dropped by a courier, likely Heinonen, during a trip to Washington. It had been meant for another agent, someone Abel was running in the Pentagon or Northern Virginia defense facilities. The message, once decrypted, contained instructions for a dead drop location and meeting schedule. The intended recipient never retrieved it because Thomas found it first. On June 21, 1957, FBI agents arrested Rudolf Abel in his Brooklyn studio at 7 a.m. Abel opened the door in his pajamas, unsurprised by a dozen armed men. He said nothing, didn't resist, simply stood aside. The search uncovered a treasure trove, hollowed-out bolts containing microfilm, cufflinks with hidden compartments, cipher pads, a shortwave radio, photographs of military installations, bank records showing payments through Swiss and Finnish accounts. The arrest made headlines immediately. Soviet spy ring broken. Master agent captured after decade of espionage. The trial began in October 1957 in Brooklyn Federal Court. Abel was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, a capital offense. Hahanen testified, describing the network's operations. FBI agents testified about recovered materials. The defense argued entrapment and rights violations, but the jury wasn't persuaded. On October 25th, Rudolf Abel was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Thomas Riley's name was kept out of initial press coverage, but by late November, an Alexandria Gazette reporter identified Thomas as the boy who'd found the hollow nickel. The story ran on November 18, 1957. Local Paperboy's discovery leads to spy arrest. Within days, other papers picked it up. By December, Thomas Riley was being described in national coverage as the young patriot whose sharp eyes had helped expose a Soviet espionage network. The attention was overwhelming. Reporters appeared at the Riley house at all hours. His principal discussed whether Thomas should address the student body. Neighbors congratulated Robert Riley. But underneath the praise was something else. Questions that lingered in glances. How had Thomas known to look at the nickel? Why had it taken 2 days to report? And most dangerously, was Robert Riley under investigation? The machinery of suspicion, once activated, is difficult to stop. Thomas Riley had found the crack that broke the dam, but the flood that followed would consume more than enemy agents. For approximately 3 weeks, Thomas Riley was a hero. Letters arrived from across the country praising his patriotism. The principal invited him to speak at an assembly. Thomas stood on the gymnasium stage, uncomfortable in his dress clothes, and gave a brief speech about finding the nickel. The students applauded. For those few weeks, Thomas felt something close to pride, but the shift began almost immediately. It was subtle at first, small changes in how people looked at his family. Reporters who'd been congratulatory became aggressive with questions. They wanted to know about his father's Pentagon work. What division? What access? Had Thomas overheard classified discussions? The implication, never stated directly, was that the Riley family's proximity to Soviet espionage might not be coincidental. The FBI interviews continued, described as routine follow-ups, but growing more pointed. Agents asked Thomas to recount every interaction with Emil Goldfuss. Had Goldfuss asked about his father? Had he given Thomas anything? Thomas answered honestly, no, but the agents kept taking notes, their faces neutral but calculating. They asked about his route, whether he'd noticed anyone watching, about his father's routine, whether he brought work materials home. The questions came in waves, each session more invasive than the last. Had his father seemed nervous in the weeks before the nickel was found? Did Pentagon colleagues ever visit the house? Had Thomas noticed cars parked on their street that didn't belong to neighbors? The implication was clear. The investigators weren't just building a case against Abel. They were examining whether Robert Riley himself had been compromised. Each interview left Thomas feeling more anxious, more certain that something he said might be twisted into evidence against his father. At school, the atmosphere changed with disturbing speed. Teachers who'd praised him in November began treating him with careful distance by January. His friends' parents stopped allowing their children to visit the Riley house. Thomas would overhear fragments of conversations, concerns about security risks, questions about whether the family had been properly vetted, suggestions that perhaps the Rileys knew more than they were saying. The praise that had felt so validating in those first weeks curdled into something toxic, a spotlight that revealed not heroism but suspicion. His father was placed on administrative leave in mid-January 1958. Standard procedure, they said, for anyone whose family had been involved in a counterintelligence matter. Security protocols required comprehensive review. The review was described as temporary, a formality, but temporary stretched into weeks, then months. Robert Riley wasn't allowed to return to his office, access his files, or communicate with former colleagues. He stayed home, increasingly withdrawn, his hands shaking when he thought no one was looking. The neighbors changed. Congratulations. Stopped. The Kowalskis stopped coming to the door. Mrs. Patterson had nothing to say. At school, Thomas's friends began avoiding him. The parents had talked, had decided. By February, Thomas overheard mothers outside school saying Robert Riley must have been under investigation before the nickel was found, that maybe the whole family should move elsewhere for everyone's safety. The logic was circular and paranoid, but it was the logic of the era. The psychological toll on Thomas was severe. He stopped sleeping well, replaying November 3rd, wishing he'd left the nickel on the sidewalk. He had nightmares about men in suits, about his father being taken away. His grades dropped. The school counselor asked how he felt. Thomas said he was fine. No one pushed. In late February, his parents decided to leave Alexandria. His father's administrative leave had effectively ended his Pentagon career. Even if cleared, the association with the Soviet case would follow him forever. Robert Riley found work as an insurance adjuster in Columbus, Ohio. The family packed, sold the house at a loss, and left Virginia in early March. The move didn't solve anything. Someone in Columbus recognized Robert Riley's name from news coverage. The whispers started again. By 1960, they'd moved again to a smaller town outside Cleveland. Robert Riley's health deteriorated, high blood pressure, chronic headaches, chest pains. The doctor said stress-related, but you can't rest your way out of systemic suspicion. Thomas watched Rudolf Abel's trial on television from Columbus. He watched the conviction, the sentencing. And in 1962, when the United States exchanged Abel for U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, Thomas sat before the television and felt nothing. Abel walked to freedom in East Germany. Powers came home to parades. And Thomas Riley, the boy who'd found the nickel that started it all, watched his father's career die slowly while the man his discovery had helped capture went free. Robert James Riley died of a heart attack on March 17, 1964, 3 weeks before his 49th birthday. He was at his desk at the insurance company, reviewing claim forms. A coworker found him slumped forward. The official cause was acute myocardial infarction, but everyone who knew Robert Riley understood the real cause. Years of accumulated stress from a destroyed career, a ruined reputation, a life reduced to something meaningless when it had once held purpose. Thomas was 16, a quiet, withdrawn teenager who moved through high school without making much impression. He had no close friends, participated in no activities. He was smart enough to pass classes without effort, but showed no ambition. His mother tried to reach him, but Thomas had learned that talking about feelings didn't change circumstances. His father's death confirmed what he already believed, that the world was arbitrary and cruel, that doing the right thing brought no rewards. Margaret Riley deteriorated after her husband's death. The depression she'd been fighting deepened into something clinical. She drank starting with wine in the evenings, escalating to half a bottle, then more. By 1967, she was drinking every day, starting in afternoons. Thomas took over managing household bills, grocery shopping, basic functions his mother couldn't handle. He was 19, working part-time at a warehouse, watching his mother die slowly just as his father had died. His mother died in January 1971 from liver failure complicated by pneumonia. She was 51. Thomas buried her beside his father in a veterans cemetery outside Cleveland. After the funeral, attended by fewer than a dozen people, Thomas sold the apartment and enlisted in the Army. It wasn't patriotism. It was the absence of any other option. The Army didn't work out. Thomas's service record shows a pattern of insubordination, refusal to follow orders, conflicts with officers. His discharge in 1973 was classified as other than honorable. He left Fort Benning at 28, more lost than he'd been at 16. The years that followed were a series of failed attempts at normal life. Thomas worked low-wage jobs, warehouse worker, delivery driver, night shift security guard. He married twice, both marriages ending in divorce within 2 years. He couldn't talk about his past, couldn't open up. He drank not as heavily as his mother, but enough that it became a problem. He moved frequently, never putting down roots, always carrying the weight of what his discovery had cost. In the mid-1970s, historians researching the Abel case began contacting Thomas for interviews. The transcripts reveal a man deeply bitter. He told one historian in 1977 that finding the nickel was the worst thing that ever happened to him, that it had destroyed his family. He said the FBI had used him without considering consequences. He wished he'd thrown the nickel away. The final interview Thomas gave was in 1995 to a graduate student. Thomas was 50, living alone in a subsidized apartment in Cleveland, working part-time at a convenience store, his health failing. The student asked if he'd do it differently. Thomas thought for a long time. He said he'd been 12 years old and scared and trying to do what his father taught him was right. He said loyalty and patriotism had seemed simple then. But he'd learned that nothing was simple, that the government he'd trusted had destroyed his father's career, driven his mother to alcoholism, and left him with lifetime guilt and isolation. He said the system that used his discovery should have protected him. And it didn't. Thomas Riley died on November 8, 2003, in a VA hospital in Cleveland. He was alone, no family, no friends. He was 58. His death generated no news coverage, no obituaries beyond a standard death notice. He was buried in the same veterans cemetery where his parents rested, his grave marked with a simple headstone listing his name, dates, and branch of service. There was no mention of the hollow nickel, no reference to the spy ring. The Rudolf Abel case remains one of the most studied espionage cases in American history. Abel became a legend in Soviet intelligence circles, celebrated as a hero who endured American imprisonment without breaking. His network had provided the U.S. with valuable intelligence for nearly a decade. The FBI's success in breaking the network was considered a major victory, but in all that documentation, Thomas Riley is rarely more than a footnote. The boy who found the nickel. His name appears in case files, but his story, the cost he paid, the life his family lost, is largely absent. The focus remains on spies and investigators, on dramatic espionage and geopolitical stakes. The ordinary American child who stumbled into that world and was consumed by it doesn't fit neatly into those narratives. Thomas Riley's grave is unremarkable. The grass is mowed regularly. Small flags are placed on Memorial Day. But no one visits. No one remembers him as anything other than a name on a stone. The hollow nickel that changed his life is now in the FBI Headquarters Museum, displayed in a glass case. The label describes it as evidence from the Rudolf Abel case. It doesn't mention Thomas Riley. History remembers the spies and forgets the witnesses. It celebrates the investigations and overlooks the casualties. When people study the Abel case today, Thomas is absent. His story doesn't fit. It's too sad, too honest about the cost of secrets. But the cost was real. The family was destroyed. And the boy who found the nickel paid for that discovery for the rest of his life, carrying a guilt that wasn't his to carry but that he couldn't put down.